Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Oliver Twist. Chapter 11. Oliver is rescued. After the unsuccessful housebreaking, Oliver, wounded and unconscious from the gunshot, was left in a ditch by Toby and Sykes as they made their escape. He awoke hours later with a cry of pain. A bloody bandage was wrapped around his arm. He struggled to his feet and dragged himself toward the nearest house. It was, in fact, the house they had tried to rob. Oliver staggered across the lawn and knocked faintly at the front door. Giles and Brittles, the servants, jumped at the sound of the knock. "It's a boy!" exclaimed Giles. "He's badly hurt. In fact, he's one of the robbers. I shot him. Let's make sure he doesn't die. I want to see him hanged for his crime." "Hush, Giles," said the lady of the house as she came to the door. "Go in town and fetch a doctor at once." There were, in fact, two ladies in the house. One, a stately older woman, was Mrs. Maylies. The other, Rose Maylies, a beautiful girl of about 17, was her niece. The two women followed Dr. Losberne into the room where Oliver lay. They were aghast at how young he was. Rose Maylies bent over the boy, gently pushed back his hair from his face. "How shocking," said her aunt, "to think that this poor boy was the pupil of robbers and housebreakers." "He's so young and fair," added Rose. "Maybe he has never known a mother's love. Maybe he has never had a home and a family. Maybe he was forced into a life of crime because he was starving. We must think about this before we send him to jail." Oliver was very ill and weak from the loss of blood, but after several days of care by Rose, Mrs. Maylies, and Dr. Losberne, he gradually improved. When some of his strength returned, he told the Maylies about his past. Rose wept bitterly. "We must do something to help the boy," Rose begged her aunt. "Yes, we must," said Mrs. Maylies. Then turning to Dr. Losberne, she asked, "Can you do something? Perhaps if we convince the servants that they've mistaken when they identified the boy, we can save him when the police come." The kind-hearted doctor sent for the two servants. "Giles and Brittles," said Dr. Losberne, "can you swear the boy with the robbers was Oliver? Could you really identify him in the darkness with all that gunfire?" The servants admitted they couldn't be absolutely certain. So when a policeman arrived at the house to investigate the housebreaking, no one could identify the boy, so no charges were pressed against Oliver. After all, it was difficult not to pity the poor boy. He looked so helpless and innocent lying there in bed. Could he really have wanted to rob the house? Oliver recovered quickly from his wounds and entered upon the happiest period of his life since his stay with Mr. Brownlow. The Maylies treated him like a member of their own family, and when the spring came, they took him to their cottage in the country. One day, Dr. Losberne took the boy to Mr. Brownlow's house. Oliver wanted very much to explain why he hadn't returned with the change from the books. Alas, the house was empty, and a "for rent" sign hung on the door. Shouldn't that be "to let," since that's the British version? Where has Mr. Brownlow gone?" the doctor asked a neighbor. "He packed his things and left for the West Indies just 6 weeks ago. His housekeeper, Mrs. Bedwin, and his friend, Mr. Grimwig, went with him." Oliver was disappointed, but they kept busy helping Rose and her aunt with their household chores. He also learned to read and write. He spent many happy hours running along the country roads, picking flowers, feeding the birds. In the evenings, he listened to Rose play the piano. The happy days ended suddenly when Rose developed a terrible fever. Her hands were too weak to play the piano, and her face was deathly pale. Each day she got weaker. Finally, Mrs. Maylies sent Oliver running to the inn in town 4 miles away to leave a letter with the postman for Dr. Losberne. As Oliver stood outside the inn watching the mail rider saddle his horse, a horrible-looking man with purple lips and red sores on his hands came running towards him from the inn. Curses on your head, cried the man wildly. Death on your heart, you imp. Why can't I be free of you? When the man came at Oliver with his fish face, Oliver turned on his heels and ran away. He turned his head back along, to see the man fall to the ground, writhing and foaming in a fit. Rose's fever came dangerously high. When Dr. Losberne arrived, he offered very little hope for her recovery. There was nothing to do but pray, he said sadly. Rose fell into a deep sleep. The doctor stayed for her bedside for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 4th day, he left the room and came out to Mrs. Maylie. The worst is over, he cried happily. The fever is broken. God has blessed Rose. She will live. Oliver was overcome with joy. He went out to gather the most beautiful flowers he could find for Rose's sick room. When he returned to the cottage, he saw a handsome young man climb down from a coach. It was Mrs. Maylie's son, Harry. The young man rushed to find Mrs. Maylie and cried, Mother, why didn't you write to me sooner? What if Rose had died? You know why I waited, Harry. If a rich and successful man marries a lady upon whose name there is a stain because the story of her birth is doubtful, he will be sorry later in life. I love you, my son, and I love Rose too, dearly, but evil people will not let you forget her past, even though it is not her fault. And Rose too will suffer because you will turn against her. I would never turn against Rose, cried Harry angrily. She is my life and my happiness. Let her decide if she wants to be with me, Mother. Mrs. Maylie agreed that Harry would be permitted to see Rose as soon as she was well enough to leave her room. The following evening, as Oliver sat on the front porch, half awake, half dozing, Fagin's face flashed in front of him. Come away, my boy, came the voice of Fagin. Then another man appeared with Fagin, the horrible-looking man who had tried to attack Oliver at the inn. In an instant, the 2 men were gone, and Oliver leaped the garden screaming for help. Harry Maylie knew Oliver's history and understood his fright. He and Giles combed the hedges, the ditches, and footpaths. There was not even a trace of footsteps. It must have been a dream, Oliver, said Harry when they returned. No, it was really Fagin, the boy insisted. Fagin and the man who cursed at me when I went to the post the letter to Dr. Losberne. The search continued, but in vain. And that's the end of that chapter. Okay, so in the other chapter, it said none of the lady's servants will go with us, to the house. And does she have other servants besides Giles and Brittles? Because you don't see any others. Well, goodbye.